Hello, everyone. Happy Monday, I guess, unless you're in Australia or New Zealand. For those of you in lockdown in your respective countries, reminder today is Monday. I don't know about you, but I'm losing track of which day it is of the week. Just a couple of reminders. Actually, before we start, we had a bit of a mixed bag of people commenting last time on the sound. Some people could hear, some people couldn't. So we've done a little bit of tweaking again like we did on the second session. So hopefully this is the right amount of volume. If it's too loud, just turn your volume down. If it's too quiet or you can't hear a thing, then you're not listening to what I'm saying right now either. So there's probably no point in me saying what to do. But hopefully you can all hear me clearly. We'll get started in a second. Morning, Bruce. Hello, Darren. Hi, everyone else. So let's, quick reminder, standard stuff. So number one, we are working on the latest version of Capture One. That's 20.0.4. There's a few bug fixes in that have helped quite a few things smooth out. For those people that want to buy Capture One this month, the guys over there are doing 25% off the Pro version. And if you already have Capture One, then you've got the 30% off upgrade using that code, upgrade 30 on your screen. You've got until the end of the month to do that. Hi, Peter. Good morning-ish. Not sure whether it was morning or afternoon for you. I think it may be afternoon. So also remember your comments, there is a little bit of a delay. There's about 15-second delay in Facebook Live and other live tools. So it may take a little bit for me to notice anything. It's not me being rude. It's just there's a little bit of a delay. Final thing before we start editing, we've got 3 images to edit today in detail. So final thing, if you don't want to pay for an upgrade, you can enter the cool competition that gets you a free pro license if you win. So if you want to go to our site, so paulreefer.com/edit with us, that's all in conjunction with Capture One. So they have a 30-day editing challenge. Mr. Grover is online. He is the Capture One guru in the UK. So he's part of that group, and there's a whole plan of activity over 30 days. Just little snippets and little tidbits, sort of 10-15 minutes at a time, that will cover everything from advanced layers through to, we do a session on backups and all that sort of stuff. You will find the answer to that competition in that 30-day challenge. It's very, very easy. Just head to that page. You'll learn more. But if you don't want to wait to see if you won in the competition, but then why wouldn't you? But if you don't want to wait, then obviously you can go and use those codes and go get your copy now. Everything that we're doing today, you can use the 30-day trial version that will also, you can download for free, and it'll give you unlimited access to everything that we're doing. So let's go into Capture One. And let's start with this image. And there's a couple of reasons we're going to start with this image. I had a couple of questions on email about the difference between shadows and blacks, and there are 2 images in this week's that we're going to go through which specifically cover the difference between shadows and blacks, and actually will hopefully visually explain why that differentiation was made in the last version. So this is a shot. Hopefully you guys can see there is a glimmer of the Northern Lights in this shot. Not sure exactly where it was shot, but certainly somewhere northern. On a Fuji GFX 100. So this camera does a great job at night. ISO 1600, it's relatively noise free. We'll zoom in a little bit just to see. But what we have in this shot, that's just before we do anything, just a reminder, we're going to do that little analyze thing on chromatic aberration for this lens. So that's done an analysis, of the entire image, and it's made sure that for this exact lens on that exact sensor, not just a generic or a general profile, it's actually applied it to this particular image and corrected any aberration that was in the image. We don't have to worry about too much in terms of diffraction, and defringing is going to be pointless for us on this particular image. But if we look at this image in general, let's just pull up our exposure. We can see an awful lot of light that was up there. Now, so to everyone else, so hello David, hello ST, hello Ian. Cool, everyone's the happy gang. It's almost like we've got a little editing club. It's quite cool. So let's talk about Northern Lights. For those of you that have seen it, lucky you. I've seen it quite a few times. It is spectacular when you see it above your heads. However, the camera is definitely able to see more than the human eye can in this case. So the Northern Lights, if you were to be able to describe it naturally, it's like a faint sort of whisper above your head. It can become quite vibrant if you're lucky. But most of the time what you're seeing is sort of whispers of, and it can get confused with clouds at night under moonlight. So your eye obviously doesn't have a long exposure mode. We have a night mode, I guess, if you want to call it that, where our irises open up and our pupils dilate, so that allows more light in. But a camera over a long exposure with a very high ISO is going to actually end up being more sensitive to that light, albeit potentially with some noise, than our eyes are. So in here, in this image, we've got a bit of a challenge because I want to pull out all this detail up in this. So let's pull it back to our standard exposure. Let's look at this histogram here. We've got a huge amount of data off of this left-hand side. Nothing's overexposed. We could have got away with a little bit longer if we wanted to, but I'm guessing, who's this? This is Bert's image. So I'm guessing the reason for using a sort of 2.6 second exposure rather than anything longer is because we didn't want these stars to become lines. We want them to remain points. So obviously if you do a long exposure, let's say you did 10-15 seconds, a lot of Northern Lights images are around 20 seconds or so, especially on a wide lens, you're going to see at the edges these stars become more like streaks of light as they pull off to any distortion in the lens in the corners. With a telephoto lens, you'll actually see even worse if you think about it, but then you also wouldn't be capturing the landscape at the same time. So we've got a limited exposure time, but we can see there's enough data in here to pull it out. In fact, let's pull up our exposure all the way up. And we've got all this detail here in our shadows. Yes, we've got a lot of noise in there. We'll talk about that in a second. So we don't want to pull this up too much because this is going to be a little bit rough in terms of print. But we haven't lost anything in the overall image. So let's pull our exposure back. And I'm going to worry about the sky in a second later. But here's a big example, and I'm actually going to create a clone of this variant so you can see with your own eyes the difference between the two options here, between increasing the blacks and increasing the shadows. So remember, in terms of this histogram, the shadows is roughly the bottom 25 to 30%, something like that. The black area of the image, as far as the histogram is concerned, is probably, if you imagine it's the bottom 10% or even less, it could be the bottom 8 to 10%. So on this image, let's completely rescue the shadows. So it's taken anything that was in the bottom, let's say 30% of the image, and it's pushed that histogram up. So it's brightened everything in the shadows. It hasn't had the effect like we did just now with our exposure of overexposing the areas that were in the middle of the histogram. It's only attacked the bottom half, but it has pulled it all up. Now let's do the same with blacks. So that was with the shadows slider, the bottom, let's say 30%. This is with the black slider, which is the bottom less than 10%. And what we've got is a much more flat change. So if we look at that histogram up here compared to the histogram of the shadow recovery, you're going to see there's a massive difference in terms of where those spikes land. And the reason is because it's only increased the brightness in that bottom 10% of the histogram. So perfect example, let's look at this snow here. The black in Dynamic Range Recovery hasn't pulled this snow much further than where it was to begin with. In fact, let's go to the original. We can see this snow level here. Let's go to this brightness. And then the black recovery, it's not much difference. And the reason is because the snow wasn't in that bottom 9 or 10%. So the blacks is genuinely only attacking the very, very darkest parts of the image. Whereas the shadows, let's go to our original again. Let's go to that snow. This snow, and actually most of the image, was in that bottom 30% of the histogram. So let's pull up our shadows, and now we've brightened the snow. But we've brightened the snow by only a bit. So what we haven't done, I'm going to create another clone, and remember that trick that I just did in terms of pulling up the exposure. So if I just pulled the entire exposure up, yes, I'd get the sky nice and bright, but I've also affected the snow. So this is our original exposure. This is with just using exposure to pull it up by 3 stops. This is by adjusting blacks only, and this is by adjusting the shadows, so the bottom third of the image, or the bottom 25 to 30% of the image. So in this particular case, we can definitely see that out of all of those three options, the original exposure, overexposed, black recovery, or shadow recovery, the shadow recovery is the right tool for this job. Now there'll be other examples, and I'm going to take you into one in a second, the next picture we go to in fact, that will show you a scenario where using that black slider is going to be much more effective than using shadows. But a lot of people get confused here between what's the difference between the dark parts of the image in the shadows and the dark parts of the image in the black areas. And the difference is that part of the histogram that it's going to attack. So let's get rid of these two variants. So I've just clicked on them and pressed delete. So there's my original, and here's my one with full shadow recovery. We might not use all that full shadow recovery. In fact, what I'm going to probably do is pull it down just a touch. I don't want the Northern Lights to look like a disco show. It needs to look natural, and the Northern Lights, yes, they can be pretty bright, but they need to also look like they were actually born out of nature. So, hi Michelle, hi Winnie from Malaysia. Hey, it's pretty late there. So, let's go into our white balance, because this is another thing with the Northern Lights specifically. They play havoc with your camera's auto white balance. So your camera is obviously trying to work out in any one scene what should be neutral white. So it's looking for color temperature, and it's trying to work out where that should sit on the balance of Kelvin scale and tint. In this case, it's used the shot auto white balance. Presumably it was auto. Quite often at night we'll choose to shoot in manual, but we'll go on to the fact that by using RAW, or by shooting in RAW, we can obviously change it later. So what we can do here is we can use our little dropper. So over here is our little pipette tool. So the auto white balance tool in Capture 120 got a lot better than the previous versions. It's a little more intelligent in terms of where it picks up the white from. And let's choose a bit of the snow. There we go. Now we're looking a hell of a lot more natural. So I could do that manually. Of course, I could use this Kelvin scale here, and actually if I wanted to overdo it a little bit, let's go a little bit warmer there. Let's go a little bit to the pink side there. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's pretty natural. But actually, Capture One was more than capable of doing that with this picker tool here, which is the one next to the mode function in white balance. That's going to give you at least a starter. So let's go there. Okay, and then if I wanted to, then I could tweak it a little bit. So if I want it a little less green on this baseline here, a little warmer, not too much. There, that looks nice and cold. Cool. So let's talk about the overall crop in this image. In terms of the rule of thirds, you know, we could do with this line here, this snow line and mountain line coming down a little bit in the frame. Also this lot here, it's not really adding anything to the image down the bottom. We've got a little bit here, there's probably some light coming from either a street light or a car or something, so we've got a bit of a distraction here. We could heal that out, we could use the healing brush. Hi Fernando. But instead of that, let's use our crop tool. So remember, I can just click on the crop tool, and I can use my modifier keys to control whether or not. So let's go to unconstrained. So now it's completely free crop. If I hold down the shift key, it's going to force the original crop. So in this case, it was a 4:3 crop on a Fuji sensor. But I don't want that same crop aspect ratio. So instead in Capture One, what I can do is hold down here up on the crop tool, and I can choose a ratio. If I want a different ratio to the ones that are standard, I can just literally click on add aspect ratio and type in whatever number I want. As I said this a couple of sessions ago, one word of warning with custom aspect ratios. They're great to get exactly the crop that you want defined. They're not so great when you want to go and frame it with a standard framing company or a standard framing format. So 2:3 is quite a common panoramic, well, not panoramic, landscape format. So let's do that. Now when I move these handles, whether or not I have the shift key, so let's remove the shift key, and now it's going to fix that aspect ratio at 3 across and 2 high. And it's difficult to describe on the screen, if I push this corner, it almost feels like you're forcing it across. It flips into vertical mode. And then if I want it to go into landscape mode, I'm going to pull it across, and then it goes into landscape mode. So it's intelligent enough to know whether I mean portrait or landscape. In this case, we want landscape. Let's pull that across the full width of the image. And I'm just going to get rid of any light parts here. So what I'm looking for in a crop is to make sure that I don't have anything like this at the edge of that crop. Because what ends up happening is either it's distracting or we're going to end up having to heal it out anyway. So it's much better if I just move that crop up to there. Yeah, let's just make sure everything else is good. Okay. And hit the enter key, which again was new for Capture 120. You can hit the enter key in the crop sticks. But actually that's quite important. You can do that now. So now we've got a crop that actually feels a bit more like a landscape image. We've lost some of that foreground stuff that was distracting. In here, we've got a bit of a distraction here as well, actually. Now, I still want to keep this in, but I want it to be less obvious. So we've done a lot of Luma Mask before. I'm going to do the same here. So a new layer on this left-hand side here, and I call this one Jetty. And with our brush, so I'm going to right-click on the image and check my settings are okay. In this case, I want 100% opacity. I want 100% flow. Soft brush is fine. This size is okay. In fact, I'm going to make it slightly smaller. So to make it smaller, I can right-click and change this slider. Or I can use the square brackets. Left square bracket makes it smaller, right square bracket makes it bigger. Let's just paint a happy little area over here. And I'm going to turn on the mask in a second so you can see what I'm doing. So to turn on the mask, we press the M button, M for mask. If I had left it on when I was drawing it, you'd have seen the red area increase as I was drawing, but I just happened to leave it off. So with that mask, that's great, and I want to now pull down some of those, and again it's not the whites because it's not the top 10% of this image, so we can see by pulling it down it's not making any difference. It might be the highlights. No, not really. So actually these are midtones, so even though they to our eye look very bright in the image, what you've got to remember with Capture One is Capture One doesn't care what the subject is. It doesn't actually look at this and say, oh, you're the brightest part of the image, therefore you're a highlight. What it's looking at purely is the histogram. And in this case, we can see on that histogram that even though this is a bright part of the image, perceptually, actually it's not in that top 25 to 30%. So the whites area isn't going to catch it, nor is the highlights area. It's midtone. So the way that we can adjust midtone, unfortunately, is with exposure. Well, my little rough mask there is probably not going to cut it, because as I pull exposure down, yeah, it's going to affect the whole area that I masked, not just the jetty. So we've got our cool tool, which is the really funky one, which is Luma Range. So let's turn our mask on and click on this Luma Range. And on here, we know that we only want to affect the midtones. We don't. So previously, we've only wanted to affect the highlights, so we've only wanted to affect the shadows. So we've done a lot of that in previous images. And we've been typically going like that, or we've been going the opposite way and like this and then feathering it off. In this case, actually, we know this is a midtone and we don't want to affect the shadows, and we know there aren't really any highlights. So we want to start from maybe here, and what I'm doing is I'm looking at this chart here and matching it to where my histogram is here. So I know there's nothing up here, so I'm not too worried about the Luma Range there. But I know I don't want to catch the water. I only want to catch the brighter areas on this jetty. So let's pull this up until we're only looking at the jetty. There we go. There's a little bit over there that we'll deal with separately. And because I want this to fall off quite gradually, I want the effect to be very subtle, we're going to pull down this little fall off slider here. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can see what that's doing actually when we do that. So here's our jetty. I'm going to go to a bit of an extreme, just so you can see. And what we said was, well, we know there's not really any highlight areas. There's a little bit there. But now let's pull up so we're only hitting the jetty. Now that's great, but obviously when I pull the exposure down, these lines, these hard lines and this harsh transition here are going to become very, very obvious. So let's turn our mask off. Let's say I were to pull this exposure down. You see here we get all this ugly stuff around here. It's like a pattern. And that's where there's a hard fall off between what we've said to include in the Luma Mask and what we've said you can ignore. So instead of that hard fall off, what we use is, funnily enough, this fall off segment in here. So as I pull this across, you see that fall off start to change. So it's gone from being a really harsh line over where the midtones were, and then anything that was in shadow being instantly not affected, to, I'm just going to do it there, and we're going to fall off much more gradually there, so that you don't notice it so much. So let's apply that. Let's go back to our image, and now in that jetty we've got complete control over how bright the jetty is. Just the jetty. Now there's a little bit out here I'm going to deal with in a second, but let's look at this for now. So let's pull it down to there maybe. That's just a little better in terms of level of distraction. It doesn't need too much actually. What I'm also going to do with this layer is desaturate it a little bit. It's very yellow, it's very warm. I could do it with white balance, but actually in this case I just want it to go a little bit grayer. Like that. Let's pull down our brightness a touch as well. Great. Now what I noticed when I was doing that, let's turn this layer off. So we've got all this detail here, and then turn it on again, and we flattened all the detail out, and it's because this is included in that Luma range. So remember, there is nothing stopping you. Even though you've set a Luma range, we can still choose an eraser, and we can choose a size quite small there. In this case, I'm going to set it to 100% opacity because I want to get rid of it all. And I can erase. So I've still got manual control over this mask, or even though I've used the mask to actually only access parts of the Luma range in this image, I've still got manual control. Now in here, this is a bit more tough because I still want some of this, but I don't want the bright parts of it. So instead of 100% opacity, I'm just going to shift it to 40 or 50, and then just pull that in there, and to there, a little bit there, touch there. I think that's probably it, a little bit there. So with our mask on, sorry, off, and with that layer on. So hopefully you can see on your screens, let's just zoom in just a bit, the difference. So this isn't about trying to get rid of the pier or the jetty. It's about just trying to take it away from the first thing that we see, stop it being the focal point, make sure that people are looking at the mountains and the lights up there. Okay, where are we? David, you could also increase the radius in the Luma Range tool. Sensitivity at 0 would feather the mask, and 100. Yes, it would. So if we instead of on the on the mask tool here in red, if I shift and I'm talking about Option and M, instead of seeing it in red, I can just isolate this grayscale area of the mask. And in the Luma Range here, what we can do with this. Let's just zoom in before we do that. And to here, so with our Luma range, we also have this radius tab here, and that can soften things out. It's going to recalculate stuff. So if you look at these areas here, look at it here, it's very, very sharp, that mask effect. Whereas if I start pulling this radius up, you're going to see that masking. So remember, we're not blurring the image, we're blurring the mask. Sorry, I've still got a comment over the top. Let's do that again. So let's pull our radius. Thank you, David. Let's go there. So with no radius set. So remember, this radius, even though it looks like it's blurring, it's not blurring your image, it's blurring the mask over the top of the image. So it's blurring and softening how much of an effect that mask has over the top of your actual raw data. So with no radius set here, you can see this is very sharp, it's very hard fall off. And if we pull this radius up, let it think for a second, there we go. It softens everything out. So let's apply that mask for now. Let's just turn off our mask so we can see. And yeah, we're back to natural. Cool. So we just go from something that's very, very obvious to something that's not quite so obvious, but it's still there. Okay, and now our sky. So we've got a couple of things that we can do. First is, let's just really make the sky punch a little bit. So I don't want to bring any more attention to this foreground here. Really don't want that, because we want the viewer to look up in the image. So we're going to create a new layer called sky. And as you can imagine, gradient filter. At night, you're typically not going to use a gradient filter. Certainly not for capturing the northern lights. The one thing you don't want to do is cut the amount of light that's going into the camera in the top half of the image. And we're not going to use the gradient filter in a traditional way. So the traditional way of gradient filtering would be use it for exposure. Well, that doesn't make sense when the subject of the image is the northern lights. So what we're using it for here, and let's just see the mask there. So it's a very, very soft fall off here over the snow. And just in this area here, so remember these three lines go from 100% applied on the mask, 50% applied on the mask, 0% down here. And as I move these lines, it gets a harder and harder fall off. And I can hold down the Option key on these lines, and I can independently control the fall off between 0 and 50 and 150. So let's just go back to pretty much standard. Okay. And then with this layer, and this is one thing that's fantastic with Capture One, especially for Northern Lights images, clarity. So as we pull that up, we get, you see up here, all of these little streaks start to appear. So let's just turn that off. So it's nice and soft, that's nice. But here we've got all this detail up here and all these contrasty points. Let's pull up our contrast a touch as well. And the reason is because I actually want the sky to become darker. So I want the darker areas to become darker and some of these mid-tony areas to just push a little bit brighter there. And I'm going to pull our exposure up a touch. That's really nice. And then on this area, I'm going to use that. Remember we talked about the blacks area versus the shadows area? So in our blacks area here, actually, if we look at the sky, we've got in the bottom 10%, a lot of it is up there. So let's just use that to create some real contrast. We can push our saturation a little bit, push our exposure a little bit now. So let's look at without and with. So that's had two effects. Because we've got this soft fall off here, some of that effect is still applying to these mountains here, still applying to the snow. So not only are you now defining this Northern Lights area up here a lot more strongly, you're also able then to see all of this detail here in the mountain a lot more clearly. Now you might find that we've got a little bit more noise as a result of doing some of this. The noise reduction in Capture 120 got a lot better. It's actually pretty clean still at 1600 ISO. Actually, it's done a good job already. If you wanted to enhance the noise reduction, go to your background layer. Remember, not just the sky, although in this case, you could just be affecting the sky. And we could improve our noise reduction in the luminance slider there. On this image, personally, I wouldn't do it. You end up with what I call squigglies, but you end up with slight patterns in the sky, especially with Aurora images. So just be careful with doing noise reduction when you're shooting into the Northern Lights. Okay, so on that image, if we have a look at, there's our original, and there's our finished one. So again, with all of these images, this is just playing with the raw data that the camera recorded. And had we at the time put our white balance down to 4067 and our tint to 8.3 instead of whatever it was shot at, which was 5258 and 1.7, which I'm guessing is probably what the camera saw as an auto white balance value. Had we done that, we would have ended up with the same tone. If we had some clever glass filters that could do clarity, then wonderful, but most of us don't, unfortunately. What I could do in here is one final little step. I'm just going to put a new layer in there called foreground and another gradient, but a really subtle one, and I want it to fall off well before the mountain. So I'm going to do that and then hold down my option key to do that. And remember what that means is 100%, 50%, and then straight to 0% pretty quickly. And with this mask, all I'm going to do is just pull our exposure down a bit, not too much. And in fact, we're just going to move this mask up a little bit there. All that's doing is it's just taking, again, another little bit of focus away from this bottom line here. And we go to there. So let's just have a look at that, how that looks. It's pretty nice. Cool. So on these ones, hopefully that sort of makes sense to people around the difference between the shadows and the black slider in high dynamic range. The exact same applies to highlights and white. So white is the top within 10%, let's call it 8 to 10%. Highlights is the top sort of 25 to 30%. The same would apply. So just be careful which slider you're using, because if you use the wrong one, you can end up with a very flat image and it looks over processed and too much HDR'd. Okay, are there any questions on that one while I have a quick sip of water? And if there aren't, then we'll go on to another one, which has also got some HDR recovery stuff in. Guessing not, but I can't remember how long 15 seconds feels like. Okay, let's move on to the other one, and then just in case we can always come back if not. So let's go to Gautam's image. So you can guess the reason that we've picked up this one for today, because it's a great example of, unlike the last one where we needed to use shadows versus blacks in terms of pulling up the detail, in here we've obviously got some black areas and quite a lot of shadow, but it's the black areas that seem to be a little bit under. So let's have a look. So this one was shot with another Fuji, an X-T20. Cool. So again, Capture One has got a profile in built into the system that's got this lens that it was shot with. It's picked that up automatically. We can force it to analyze this particular lens on this particular camera and fix any aberration, great. We could do defringing, don't need to worry about it. There's unlikely to be any diffraction at f9, but let's have a look. So, first off, our white balance. I don't know, because I wasn't stood there, how the tone in the sky actually looked. It's possible that it was exactly like that, and it's an accurate white balance. One of the reasons, and we talk about this quite a lot with people, is that I do, is use your phone to take a picture and make sure the phone picture gives you an accurate representation of exactly what was there. The reason being is that when it comes to raw editing, you can get carried away with changing things like white balance, and you can get carried away with changing things away from reality. So be very careful, use some form of reference. And that will also help. If any of you are thinking about using an external retoucher, just be really careful, because exactly the same problem exists for those retouchers. I can remember what every single shot I took should look like because I was there at the time. If you're going to send an image to someone to retouch, they weren't there. So they either need a reference, or you need to be able to communicate to them exactly how you want the image to feel. Because as we know with white balance, I can make this image look really, really different based on what I set in that slider. We'll start from how it was shot. And knowing now what we know in terms of, let's create a new clone of that variant. So this one has all its properties reset, so there's no changes to it. It's got 1 star, so I can identify it. So knowing what we know about the high dynamic range thing, we can now probably predict what's going to happen if I do exactly the same with this one as what I did with the last one. So let's create our 3 variants just like before. This one, I'm just going to use exposure. So we can look on this histogram, we can see, well, actually there's quite a lot of detail here in the middle. There's some mid-tone detail here, some low shadow here, and there's an awful lot there that's falling off the side on the black area. So let's pull up our exposure and what I'm doing is I'm just pulling it up until this area of the histogram here hits this wall. So in other words, as bright as we can go without clipping anything. And I know I haven't clipped anything, because if I turn on the exposure warning, if I go too far, we get all this red stuff. And that's the warning saying, whoa, you're overexposed. So what we can do, actually, we can use that as a guide and say, well, let's pull our exposure up until we just clip there. Okay, so by doing that, we've got a lot more detail in the sky, a lot more detail in the midtones, but this is still really heavily in shadow. Edward's just said, I'm gardening, but would love to watch later available. Yes, Edward, you can either look at it on Facebook again on the same page. It'll be there to watch presumably forever, or it'll be on YouTube. So just go to YouTube, type in my name, and it'll hopefully come up, unless someone's trying to pretend to be me. So that's our exposure. And the reason that it's done that is because exposure is quite a blunt tool. It literally picks up our histogram and it shunts it to the right. I could do similar with brightness. But that's just, the way I look at brightness is it's effectively a flatter version of exposure compensation. So neither of those are going to do anything for us because they're moving the entire histogram up in one go. So for every single stop that it's moving the highlights up, it's also moving the shadows. The problem is you're going to get to a point where in order to see these shadows here, I've had to move the highlights up so much that I've got this issue up here. I've overexposed the sky. So the traditional way of doing this before we had all the HDR control was then on the sky, we would then effectively use a gradient filter and we would darken the sky. So we do that and we pull the exposure back down again on the sky. And then we start playing sort of ping pong backwards and forwards with, you know, brightness of the foreground, darkness of the sky and so on. And now there's just an easier way of doing it. So that's by doing it with exposure. Let's go on to just pulling up shadow. Okay, let's go to there. So again, let's do it 100. So again, remember the shadow is the bottom 25 to 30%. It's pulled up the shadows for sure, but we've still got some bits that are actually underexposed. And we've flattened out the image because we pulled up all of those midtones. So look at this histogram. Back to where it was. All of the detail that was in this sort of moody midtone area has now been shifted up to be brighter. So this has become a very different mood to the image. So let's just pull up the blacks. Let's do that. Okay. So now we've got access to only the bottom 10% of the image. It has had a small effect. It's pushed up some of that stuff into the midtone realm. It's gone very cartoony again, so just like before I was saying about pulling up that black slider to 100%, be very careful because it can go into a really, really staggeringly strong HDR mode. It looks cartoony, it starts to look fake, and to be fair, the detail that it's pulled out in here, I mean there's a bit of noise in there obviously because it was underexposed in that area, but the detail's not bad at all. It's just it doesn't look right. It doesn't make sense to our eyes because these were clearly meant to be dark and they were clearly in shadow, and then all of a sudden we've got this bright, happy green colour and all the detail that's in there. So, instead of that, in this case we're going to do a bit of a mix. So the shadows did a good job out here, but not enough down here. The blacks was too much down here, and this bit looks a little bit fake. Exposure, not loving that too much either. So, knowing what we know with those sliders, we can do a bit of a mix. So I'm just going to press the delete key, delete all of those variants, and create a nice fresh new clone. So let's put all those three things together. First off, I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit in the image, not too much. Just about one stop. That'd do. So if we had a one stop improvement. So that would be the equivalent of going from ISO 200 to ISO 400, or maybe doing it for 2 seconds, or maybe doing it at, I guess, f4.5 or wherever we would end up in there. No, it wouldn't be. Where are we at? I think it would be f5, well, 6.3, I guess. Yeah, f9 to 6.3. Okay, so that would be the equivalent of making that change in the camera. It's a minor change, no big deal. I am going to put in a new layer, which is sky, and with sky, we're going to put in a very, very subtle gradient. Really, really soft. So that distance there is showing us this mask has a really, really soft fall off, and the reason is because the light falls off really softly. If I forget the subject and just look at the light levels in this image, that's about the right fall off. So if I pull this exposure down, yeah, we're back to about the right mood. That's good. Now, down here, I do not want to affect actually up here too much. Certainly don't want to affect anything up here on the histogram. So I'm going to create a new layer called Rocks. And again, we're going to use a gradient mask, but this time we're going to use a gradient mask that falls off the opposite way. So fully applied down here, everything underneath this bottom line is at 100%. Everything between here and here, so the bottom to the middle, falls off slowly from 100% to 50%, and everything from here up to here falls off to 0% before up here the mask has no effect at all. So it's the opposite mask to our sky one that we were using to darken. And with the rocks, I don't want to use the exposure tool to bring it all up, because if I do that, it still doesn't give me what I want without making all of this too happy. So instead, I'm going to use the blacks recovery slider. Just a bit. So again, remember before at 100% it looked completely wrong. At 18%, 17%, maybe even a bit lower, maybe even 13, 14%, it still looks realistic. And let's pull up our shadows. Just a touch. So again, we're not affecting anything that's bright, we're just affecting the stuff that's in that bottom 25 to 30% of the histogram. Overall on here, actually, I could afford to make that sky a little bit moodier at the top, and we can do that just by pulling our exposure down there. And then that means that it allows me in the background now, because I'm not going to affect any of my exposure, not going to hit any of my exposure warning stuff, we can pull up our brightness a couple of notches and our overall exposure a couple of notches. Now we've done all that, we could afford, if we really wanted to use a little bit of vignetting. Now again, it depends on how people feel. Some people hate vignettes, some people love them. It depends on the image. For me, what this has shown, by pulling down this vignette, let me just pull it a bit too much. You see this right-hand side here is now much darker than the left-hand side. What that's showing me is, actually in the original exposure, this area here was brighter than this area here. The left had more light coming at it from the right, or compared to the right. Which means a vignette that sits around the middle of the image isn't going to help us too much. Instead, I'm going to create a new layer called Vignette. I'm going to use this tool here, the Radial Mask. So the Radial Mask is the same thing as the Gradient Mask, but obviously sits in a circle. So let's create a really soft one there. Just like with the linear mask, we talked about this before, goes from 100% apply, 50% apply, 0% apply, and this gradient in here tells us how softly that falls off. Because I want it to be really subtle, we're going to pull this middle circle in all the way so that this fall off is really, really, really unnoticeable at a low level. I'm going to actually make it even bigger there. Okay. So, question that ST has put up: what's the difference between brightness and exposure? This is actually very difficult to explain. The easiest way I can think of explaining it is exposure literally, but this is in my experience in terms of editing, what exposure does is it literally picks up the histogram and it shifts everything. It shifts the whole thing from the left to the right. So if I move it to the right by one stop, it literally just moves everything. So whether it was a shadow, whether it was at the very highest part of the image, whether it was in the middle part of the image or whatever, it just moves the whole thing across. And we can see that. So let's just go to our background layer. And in fact, let me create a new filled layer. Oops, just to show you. In fact, let's do brightness and... Oh, I didn't do a filled layer there. That was silly. We'll call this one exposure and this one brightness. So on our exposure layer, if we watch the histogram when we're doing this, and I pull our exposure across, you see literally the histogram just moves from left to right. And you'll get some variance in terms of the peaks and so on, especially if it pulls stuff off from the shadow area, because where it was in the shadow, so what this isn't showing you is what was to the left of the histogram, because there may have been more data in the dynamic range the camera had than what you're seeing on there. But as I move the histogram across, it's literally just picking up that entire chart and just shifting it from right to left, which means if we were there here and I pull it across, yes, I'm pulling up the shadows, but I'm now smashing all of the highlights off of the right-hand side of the histogram at the same time. And equally, if I went the other way, so from here, I could pull it down, but I'm actually pushing this histogram and the chart off to the left. Okay, let's go to brightness instead. I could have left it there. Now, brightness, as I pull it up, is actually effectively flattening that histogram. So it doesn't, what I've found when editing is it doesn't tend to push it off of the edge of the wall. So, and equally in shadow, it doesn't tend to push all of the data off the edge of the histogram. What it does effectively is it crushes it a little bit. So it sort of pushes the histogram up towards the lighter area, but it doesn't let it go off the end. So it has a flattening effect. It's a more subtle effect, but it's not shifting everything in the histogram literally from left to right or from right to left. It's actually flattening that curve a little bit and pushing the midtones and the bright areas out towards the brighter part of the histogram, and it's actually letting the shadows stay in the back and drag a little bit, and vice versa. So, for example, on this one, if I put brightness all the way up, and on this one I put exposure all the way up, let's turn off our warning. But actually the warning is giving you a bit of a clue. So the warning is actually telling us by moving exposure, we've shifted everything off of the edge of the histogram to the point where there's no data in it anymore. Whereas in the brightness version, there's no exposure warning. We haven't pushed anything off the edge. So it's brightened everything up, but it hasn't actually pushed the histogram along the whole thing. It's just moved and flattened that curve a little bit. In terms of our vignette here, what I want to do now is with our background just bring up that brightness a little bit, and our exposure I can afford to, because I've got a little bit of room here. Our exposure warning's still on, so I can afford to move this up quite a bit actually here. And with our vignette, I'm now going to use that circle just to softly pull the focus into him. I can afford to pull down our exposure a touch there as well. Okay. If I wanted to actually make sure I was using the whole width of this, the data in the raw image, I can use our levels tool. So let's go on to, let's just delete these two quickly and create a new one called levels. With our levels tool, oops, let's just fill it. With our levels tool, I could, and remember, let's just pull this out here so we can see. Remember that our levels has two different sliders. The top here is our output. So in other words, if you imagine this was a printer and this went from completely black to completely white, this is our output. So whatever I map down here on the histogram is going to be black. Whatever I map down here on the histogram is going to come out white. If I move this into the histogram, then parts of the image that weren't completely black will start being outputted as black. So we'll be able to see that there. Now we don't want that in this case. And actually you can do the reverse with the levels tool. We can make the output brighter than the input. So we can say actually everything that is black in the histogram, I don't want you to print out black, I want you to print out slightly off black, slightly grey. Okay, actually that sort of works. The right hand side though is where it's interesting here, because this is our output, this is our input. So what this is telling us is actually for no data, output to white. And actually we can see here that the first time that we're going to see anything outputted is probably about a third of the way along this histogram. So if I wanted to make this picture fill the whole width of the dynamic range of a print, then what I could do is pull our input all the way down there. And if we look at what that's doing to the histogram, so look up in this top left-hand corner, as I'm pulling these levels. So again, I'm not pushing anything off of the edge of the chart. To do that, I would have to move this level into here. So by doing this, you can see on this line, this bottom part here, which is input, is now within the scope of the detail and the data in the image. So what I'm saying is anything from this point and to the right is outputted as complete white, 255 on the scale. Well, that means I'm losing data. I'm leaving stuff behind. I've got all this data here that I'm missing. So you never really want your levels to go beyond where the data starts in your histogram. But we can push it to its limit. So we can get it to there, which is where the data starts. And what that's done with the histogram, you can see, is we've got a much more contrasty curve. So we've got some nice highlights there and we've got some nice shadows just by using that levels tool instead of just relying on the exposure and brightness sliders, which can be quite clunky because they're a very blunt tool. They move everything as one go without any control of left and right. So that gives us a nice feel there. The only thing I'd be tempted to do now with this is potentially play with our white balance a little bit, and then this comes down to personal preference. So if we wanted it to be sunset, this is interesting, we're getting a bit of a highlight warning on this as we move our Kelvin up. So we're actually going to pull down we're going to use high dynamic range actually for this. We're going to use our white slider and our highlight slider just to make that one disappear. And in fact, it's mostly on the sky. So we can do the same there. Because remember, I've got this mask rather handily on sky that only affects up there. Okay. Then it's just down to personal preference. But if we go from our raw to our final, you can see from there, you've got an awful lot more flexibility now from this image. So I'm not necessarily sure this is the right tone. I'm not necessarily sure it's the right white balance. But what I am sure of is we can play a lot more with this image. We've got all of the detail back in these rocks. We've got the foreground. We haven't lost any detail in the sky. In fact, we've got a lot more back. If we really wanted to, with that sky graduated mask, what we could do is pull up some clarity as well. That's also going to affect our exposure warning. But we can pull up some detail in that sky, make the clouds pop a little bit more. And from this, then there's no problem with you then going back to this and saying, well, actually, how do I want the white balance to feel? How do I want the mood to come out? Do I want it to be more warm? More, oops. Let's not do it just on the sky. Let's do it on the whole image. So be careful with that, actually. If you're playing with one particular layer, it's very easy to start doing global adjustments and then find it's only on that one layer that you've done. But if I wanted this to feel a bit more like sunset or something like that, we can do that. If we want it to feel more like moonlight, we can do that. It's then entirely up to you. But what we do know from this is we've got a scenario here where this is a lot more detail, a lot more data, a lot more of a good starting point to play with some of those colors rather than relying on the raw image that was there. Okay, final one for today, Daniel's, and it's just I just want to pick this one up. It was a bit of a random one that I saw, and what we're just going to cover is, again, it's the high dynamic range stuff, but also the white balance in this image. So from guessing, I mean, it's a, what was it shot with? A7R3 from Sony. So decent sensor. I think it's probably an airport. I'm not entirely sure, but it looks like the signs of an airport to me. We've got a decision to make about this light streak. This looks like a boat going by, probably a cruise boat. And we've got these buildings out here. But what we've also got is a lot of stuff that's very, very overexposed here. Now we're at 400%, so that's not really fair to the camera. Let's go out to 200%. But while there's a lot of detail in here, a lot of it is washed out. So let's see what we can do with this. David Poulton's just asked, would you normally adjust levels after making all other exposure adjustments? Yes, and actually David Grover has beat me to it. So effectively, it's just one to keep an eye on. Let's just go back to that image very quickly. Just be very careful. For example, I've made these levels adjustments on my levels layer, and it's one of the reasons why I keep this as a separate layer on the top. A lot of people do levels on the background, and that's perfectly fine, but there is a risk then that you forget that you've done that. So all this stuff that we're making changes on, so let's create a new filled layer in here. So let's imagine in here that in this filled layer, for whatever reason, I've chosen to move the brightness up. Well, obviously, that's going to have an effect on where the histogram sits and this level slider. So I might want to pull that back a little bit there now that I've done that. So keep an eye on that levels layer if you have changed it. And it's one of the things where quite often it's worth doing your levels slider as one of the last things you do in an image, just to keep an eye on it. Okay, let's head back into, this one. Right, so normal stuff. Let's put on our chromatic aberration analyzer, and not too worried about diffraction in here. What I am worried about though is the white balance to start with. So we've got this sort of greeny tint to some of these lights down here. If you remember a couple of sessions ago, we looked at a Las Vegas image with some tarmac. Tarmac's really useful for white balance because it should be grey. So if we click that, it's gone a lot cooler, but it's actually about right. That's what I would expect this scene to look like. Pretty cool at night. We know that this tarmac should be grey. We don't know what colour it would be under these lights. If they're LED lights, then they'd be pretty neutral. If they're sodium lights, then you're going to have a slight change. So that looks about right. I might want to tweak it just a little bit, just into there. That's kind of nice. Okay, so my white balance is corrected. Now I want to deal with this. First thing to decide, in fact, before we do any of that, let's just straighten it. Just using this straighten tool. So this tool up here, the circle around the plus, we drag from one side of the horizon to the other side of the horizon if we have one. If not, you've got to guess. And that just straightens the image right up. Okay, this area here is blown out, and so is this area here. Now we've got the tools to fix that. So let's create a new filled layer. We're going to affect everything. And we're going to call this layer highlights. We could do this in the background layer, but this just allows me to vary it with an opacity slider in a minute. We're going to pull our highlights all the way down and our whites all the way down. Now here's a little trick. So we use the dynamic range in the camera quite a lot to try and push what the camera actually saw compared to what came out on the original image. So if I turn that off and turn that on again, we've got a lot more detail in there. But here's the cool bit. You can do this again. So don't do it too much. But we can create another filled layer called more highlights. And with this, we can say to Capture One, do you know what you just did with the highlights and the whites, do it again, please. And it pulls back even more. So this is the original. This is with one layer of highlight recovered. This is with two layers of highlights recovered. So don't go overboard. If you do this too much and too much and too much, you'll actually start pulling back data that wasn't there, and frankly, Capture One's going to have to start making up what it thought was or what it thinks was in those highlight areas. However, you can stack highlight recovery and shadow recovery layers. So if I go from the original here to both those layers, we can see we've got a heck of a lot more detail in here. We can also now, with our background, I'm going to use that clarity slider just to make it pop a little bit, and our structure. So clarity is a mid-tone adjustment. It's looking at areas and it's going to make everything a little more defined. It's going to make things pop. Structure is looking for edges. And if you overdo structure, it looks awful. So we're at 400% again. We're being unfair to the image. But if I pull structure up to 100, yes, I've got all these lovely sharp edges and hard lines. However, it looks horrible. And actually, we've got a telltale sign of too much sharpening in here, which is this halo over the top. You know you've sharpened an image too much when a dark line into a white line has a light halo around it, or a light area to a dark area has a dark halo around it. So let's pull our structure back. I want it a little bit, but I don't want that much. That's enough there. And I personally prefer using structure over using sharpening. Sharpening tends to bring in a lot of noise. Structure just tends to define the edges a little bit nicer, which most of the time is what we're looking for in sharpness. We're looking at edges to be sharp. In this shot, we've got an awful lot of stuff up here that isn't too much use to us. I'm just going to add a very quick layer called Sky, and with a nice gradient. And all I'm trying to do is even up the scene. We've got a bright area here and a darker area here. Let's pull back our exposure in there. So you can see on that mask, we're affecting over here a lot more than we are affecting here. In fact, here we're not affecting it at all. So on the left, it's more heavy. On the right, it's not so much. So that's just evened down that sky. And then the final thing I do is either a 1x2 or even a 1x3 crop we could get away with on this. But let's try a 1x2. And we can now decide whether or not we want to include that boat light trail. Let's just pull up and see. So here is one crop with our boat light trail in it and the airport in the background. Let's create a clone of that variant and let's do another crop. So same aspect ratio, same everything. And this time we'll do it without any of that in the background. So with, without, absolutely your choice. Let's just go back to the original and you can see so those all look like very, very subtle changes. There's our original. There's our crop with the light trail in it, and there's our crop without the light trail. But what's interesting to me is if I look at this area here, and this is again, we're being unfair, we're at 200%, but this area of the city here compared to our finished version, look at all the detail we've now got. And that comes from, in part, doing the HDR recovery, so this high dynamic range slider here, highlights and whites. But mostly it's come from the fact that I've done it twice. So if we go from the background here, this is one set of recovery. And then in certain cameras, so the Sony is one that's very good for this. Many other cameras can do it. Certainly my Phase 1, the 150 digital back is amazing at this. I've managed to get away before with 3 different highlight recovery layers, no problem. And it just keeps seeing more and more data or detail and data as I pull it back. So here's the second layer. We've got all that back. And then if we go from where we were to where we're at, it's just a much more finished picture. Okay, so I think that's today. I don't really want to edge into another picture for right now because we're probably not going to finish it in time. If anyone has any other questions, in fact, even Mr. Grover is online still, so we can even use his knowledge from Capture One if I get stuck. But if you've got any questions, put them into the comments bit and we'll try and cover them. Failing that, what I will talk about is, remember, go there, win a license for Capture One if you don't already have one. If you do already have one and your partner or friend or whatever doesn't, then why not win it for them? You can go on there until the 15th of April and hopefully one of you will win a license, because it would be great if one of you guys won it rather than a random person. Second thing, send in images to us on the upload tool. So that's paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. There are instructions on that page that tell you exactly what to do. And if you do that, we'll try and fit them in as close as we can to when you submitted them into the next session. Next session will be on Friday, I think, which is a holiday in lots of countries. I can't remember exactly what time, but it will be up online pretty soon. It's probably 3 o'clock from memory, maybe a little bit later. I'll double check that. It's probably 3 o'clock on Friday. So failing that, if there aren't any other questions, then you guys can all go and enjoy a little bit of sunshine, hopefully, if you've got a garden. If not, then hopefully we've got lots of good TV on for the next few weeks worth of lockdown. And then failing that, I will catch you all next time. Cool. Right, Robert Tyree, you just asked a very good question. That link does not work. Which link? So we had a problem on the competition link, this one, earlier, where unfortunately there was an issue on Facebook. So funnily enough, Facebook adds something interesting to track what people are doing onto the oh no, actually, okay, right, that link will work. You're right, Robert, there's another problem with that. The link will work in about 3 minutes time, so bear with. and have another go at that link, and you'll find it's all okay and you can enter and everything's good. The quick fix for it is put it all in lowercase at the end. The longer fix is we will fix it properly right now. So hopefully that's all okay, and we'll catch you all on Friday. Okay, cheers, bye.